So we'll be discussing the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, which is, of course, the title given by Swami Medhanandaji to the original Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita. It was originally written in Bangla. This book is unique in the world's spiritual literature. And that's the first, I wanted to first talk about just how unique and how important, how valuable the text is and why. And then I wanted to focus on one particular entry from the Kathamrita, May 23rd, 1885, to illustrate some of the elements that I want to bring to your attention. So first of all, what makes it unique? What makes it so important? If you have the faith that Sri Ramakrishna himself was God, that he was an avatara, then this document is priceless because it contains the teachings of an avatara, of a modern avatara, whom we know the historical reality of his existence. He was born in 1836, left his body in 1886. There's photographic evidence that he existed, and there are his direct teachings. But it's more than just the teachings of an avatara. Another thing that's really remarkable about this is that the person who wrote the text, Mohanlal Gupta, a householder disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, he himself said that Sri Ramakrishna trained me from an early age to produce this work. He trained him by somehow unconsciously making him keep a diary, a daily diary about everything that happened during the day. What happened is he did that from age 12, something like that. So he was able to hone his writing skills and his ability to remember with precise detail what happened on particular days. And that became an invaluable skill when it came to writing the Kathamrita, the gospel, because it's a remarkable document. He begins by saying which people exactly were in the room, what day, what time, what was the environment like, was it raining, was it sunny, all these things, all the small details. And it's important always to keep in mind that when Sri Ramakrishna gave teachings, there were always teachings addressed to a particular person or to a particular group of people. And the beauty of the Kathamrita is that you always have the context. You know whom he's speaking to, what question was asked to him that prompted that kind of answer. So you always have to contextualize his teachings, and the Kathamrita is very valuable because it gives us that context. We can, instead of saying, quoting him out of context, Thakur said this or that, but whom did he say it to? And in what context and why did he say it? These are the things we have to ask. So when there's a way of reading this text that's very important. The other thing that's wonderful about this is that he's not just having intellectual discussions. Almost on every page, you'll find that he goes into these states of samadhi, spiritual ecstasy. And it's a wonderful thing to see what triggers those experiences. Different things on different occasions. It could be he's listening to a song and it brings his mind to a high state. It could be a single word. Or he could look at one of these devotees, a pure young man. The moment he sees Purna, for instance, he goes into this high state, or not in Swamiji. It's very inspiring, that he's not just speaking from an intellectual plane, but often he's speaking directly from a spiritual plane. He comes down, he says, I'm a jal kabo. That's often, he says, I want to give you some water. I want some water, as a way of just creating some artificial desire so that his mind can. And then he starts speaking directly from that divine plane. So that's also very important. The other thing is, at the end of every chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, there's a colophon in Sanskrit where it describes the Bhagavad Gita in two ways. It's a text that teaches Brahma Vidya, the knowledge of Brahman, and it's a yoga shastra. It's a spiritual manual. It's a manual of spiritual practice. And exactly the same thing can be said for the gospel, the Kathamrita. On the one hand, you get the loftiest spiritual and philosophical teachings. On the other hand, you get the most practical, down-to-earth advice about spiritual practice, about how to conduct yourself, how to behave, how to live, how to interact with others on a daily basis. So you have to keep in mind that it's both things at once. It's not just a manual of spiritual practice, and it's also not just a philosophical text, but it's equally both. And we should acknowledge both of these dimensions. It's very important. I say this because I often find, both within the order, among the monks and brahmacharis, also among devotees, almost everybody has memorized parts of the gospel. They read it and they love it. But at the same time, there are many people who don't think deeply about it, who don't reflect on the teachings, you know. Chok buje, they listen like this, but they don't, you know, it's a text that's meant to be assimilated. And on both levels, at the level of spiritual practice, and we should not neglect also that there's a reason why he taught all these philosophical teachings. It's full of philosophical teachings. We'll find this. So we have to honor both of these dimensions of his teachings, both the philosophical side and the sadhana side, and the two go hand in hand. Many people think, oh, this dry philosophy, it has nothing to do with sadhana. Why should it doesn't have any implications for sadhana? And but that's not true. And one way of explaining this is that in Buddhism, there's the sadhana is called the Ashtanga Marga, the Eightfold Path, the Noble Eightfold Path. And the very first element in that practice is Samyak Drishti in Sanskrit, which means the right view. Have the right view of things. On that basis, on that foundation, you can go on to practice your sadhana. So in the same way, Sri Ramakrishna, what he's doing is he's telling you, this is God. You can never put a limit to God. Jini nidgun tini shogun. That reality which is impersonal is also personal. You see, that reality which is called Allah and Christ is also called Kali and Shiva. He's giving you that philosophical framework. He's saying, and on that basis, you can then do your spiritual practices. So philosophy and practice should go hand in hand. And the Kathamrita should be read in that way. That's the way I see it. And remember that the reading of the Kathamrita itself is a very potent spiritual practice. It itself is a swadhyaya. In the Gita, it says that Vangmayam tapaha, anudvegakaram vakyam, satyam priyahitam chayat, swadhyayavasanam chayava, vangmayam tapuchate. There are three kinds of austerity. And this is not the typical kind of austerity where you're standing on one foot for 5 days at a stretch and not that. So it says there's shariram tapaha, vangmayam tapaha, and manasika tapaha. And the bodily austerity is not at all this typical kind of austerities, but it's bowing down to the guru, bowing down to great sages and gurus, and practicing external cleanliness and those kinds of things. Vangmayam tapa, which is austerity of speech. Anudvegakaram vakyam satyam priyahatam chayat means you should speak in such a way that's truthful, but at the same time, that's beneficial to others and that doesn't hurt the other person. So that's, and then swadhyaya abhyasanam chaiva vangmaya, and then this abhyasa of swadhyaya, a daily routine, a daily practice of swadhyaya. And here swadhyaya typically means study of good spiritual texts. And Kathamrita is one of the best. It's an invaluable treasure in that regard. And the last thing I wanted to say, my current, the minister in charge of our Mysuru center, his name is Swami Medhanandaji. And he gave a lecture in Bilumad a few months ago. And I liked the lecture a lot. He was talking about the Kathamrita and why it's important. And he said that what's important is when you read the gospel, you should engage in what he calls Ramakrishna Sannidhya Sadhana, which means you should practice the presence of Sri Ramakrishna as you're reading the text. The beauty of this text is it's so immersive because it's not just the teachings, but it's so vivid, all the dramatic detail that M gives, you know. And the beauty of it is you should imagine yourself in that room, in his room in Dakshineshwar. You can put yourself among them. Imagine that he's speaking to you. That's the beauty of it. And especially if you can read Bangla, it's even more powerful in the original language. So that this is a practice of the presence of Sri Ramakrishna. This is a very, very potent practice. It's a kind of bhakti yoga. It's also a swadhyaya. So keep these things in mind. And now, the next question is regarding the philosophical dimension of the Kathamrita. It's full of philosophical teachings, and we often get confused because he's talking, on one page about Tantra, on another page about Vaishnavism, on another page about Advaita Vedanta, on another page about Christian practice, so many things. And we sometimes get confused. Sometimes about Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita, other times he mentions Shankara's Advaita. It can become mind-boggling a little bit. And so how do we as ordinary people, many of you don't have necessarily much philosophical background. How do we understand and try to interpret and incorporate into our own lives his philosophical teachings? So this already came up in the morning session, but one thing that's very important is always keeping in mind the context in which he gives his teachings. To whom is he speaking? Is what he's teaching a response to a particular question? If so, what is the question? That's also very important. And they're what I call verbal cues, which means they're little words that he uses to indicate this is what I believe, as opposed to what other people are saying. You know, he often says, Gyani say this, or this sect, followers of this sect say this or that, but I believe this. So when he says Amar Mot, Ekankar Mot, he often says Ekankar Mot. Instead of using the word I, he would say, these are the teachings of this place. So these are little cues that clue you into the fact that what he's about to say is his own view, his own considered view. So you have to keep these things in mind. So now, to illustrate some of these ideas, I wanted to read part of the entry from Saturday, May 23rd, 1885. Should I have you? I'll read it. Okay. I don't know if you guys prefer. You can also. We can do. Anyway. Okay. Let me read then, and then we'll slowly go through it. So. Yeah, is on in here? We can. Why don't you come and
or we can pass it around also.
Whatever you guys want. I think it'll be a little bit more lively if other people also get involved. So you can just start from the beginning, and I might interject once in a while.
Yeah. At Ram's house, Sri Ramakrishna was sitting in the drawing room.
Try to project your voice a little bit. You're reading at the page. Yeah.
Sri Ramakrishna was sitting in the drawing room on the ground floor of Ram's house. He was surrounded by devotees and was conversing with them. Mahima sat in front of him, M to his left, Paltu, Bhavanath, Nitya Gopal, Haramohan, and a few others sat around him. It was about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The master inquired after several devotees. Master, to M, hasn't the younger Narain arrived yet? Presently, the younger Narain entered the room. Master, what about him? M, who, sir? Master, Kishori, isn't Girish Ghosh coming? What about Narendra? A few minutes later, Narendra arrived and saluted Sri Ramakrishna. Master, to the devotees, it would be fine if Kedar were here. He agrees with Girish. To Mahima, smiling, he says the same thing. Ram had arranged the kirtan. With folded hands, the
musician... 1 second. I just want to pause here a second. In Bangla, Sri Ramakrishna says, Girish Ghoshel Shungi Khub Mil. Mohima Kote, Shahashe. Sheo Oi Bole. Avatar Bole. It nahi.
Sheo, he says the same thing.
He says the same, but it doesn't explain what the same thing is. Oh, so so you'll see there's some really interesting discrepancies, and also this is quite confusing without the context. Here in the Bangla.
But there is a footnote.
Oh, what is the footnote? So you should read that.
Yeah. Kedar spoke of Sri Ramakrishna as an incarnation.
Yeah, okay, so that's yes. Okay, good. Please keep going.
Yes. Okay. Ram had arranged the kirtan. With folded hands, the musician said to Sri Ramakrishna, Sir, I can begin if you give the order. The master drank some water and chewed spices from a small bag. He asked M to close the bag. The musician started the kirtan. As Sri Ramakrishna heard the sound of the drum, he went into an ecstatic mood. While listening to the prelude of the kirtan, he plunged into deep samadhi. He placed his legs on the lap of Nitya Gopal, who was sitting near him. The devotee too was in an ecstatic mood. He was weeping. The other devotees looked on intently. Regaining partial consciousness, Sri Ramakrishna said, from the Nitya to the Leela, and from the Leela to the Nitya.
Okay, let's pause here. This is also very important. See, notice, Ramakrishna is laughing, joking, talking with everybody. And the moment he hears the sound of a drum, his mind soars into the spiritual plane, and he loses consciousness of the external world, and he's immersed in God consciousness. It's a very remarkable thing. And then he does this thing of he's touching the lap, I believe, right? Yeah, Nitya Gopal. Yeah. And Nitya Gopal himself was very spiritually evolved. And then he goes into a state of bhava. So it's such a remarkable kind of environment. And then notice, immediately after he comes down, Thakur ektu prakritisto hoiya kotha koitechen. The moment he brings his mind down, he starts giving these priceless gems. And again, it's very philosophical. But notice that it's coming from a spiritual plane. Nitya theke lila, lila theke nitya. So from the nitya, from the absolute comes the play, the sportive play of God, the relative plane. Lila theke nitya, and again from the lila to the nitya. And again, remember, this is exactly what the Vijnani does. The Vijnani is the one who doesn't remain at the plane of the nitya, which is this non-dual pure consciousness, the Advaitic plane, but is able to go back and forth between the plane of the absolute and this realm of lila, which is a manifestation of God, going back and forth. Now we can continue. Yeah, so Torki, Nitya Gopal. So he's asking Nitya Gopal.
To Nitya Gopal, what is your idea? Nitya Gopal, both are good. Sri Ramakrishna closed his eyes and
what are the both here?
From Leela to Nitya.
Yeah, so both Nitya and Leela are both good. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Nitya Gopal, both are good. Sri Ramakrishna closed his eyes and said, is it only this? Does God exist only when the eyes are closed and cease to exist when the eyes are opened? The Leela belongs to him, to whom the Nitya belongs, and the Nitya belongs to him, to whom the Leela belongs. Yeah, again, so let me read the Bangla briefly. So Sri Ramakrishna chok bujiye boli dichen. Kebol emonta ki? So he's really shutting his eyes. Chok bujlei tini achen, ar chok chailei nai. Jari nitto tani lila, jari lila tani nitto. The Bangla language has a way of having very succinct formulations. In English, it almost sounds clunky. What's the expression that is? To whom the Leela belongs, to him the Nitya belongs.
Yeah, it's a very literal translation, but in Bangla it comes off so much more nicely. Jari Nitya Tari Leela. But in any case, the point is that God, that divine reality, who is the Nitya, is at the same time the Leela, and that Leela belongs to him as well. It's all God. There's nothing but God in this world. Sri Ramakrishna.
To Mahima. My dear sir, let me tell you, Mahima, revered sir, both are according to the will of God. Master, some people climb the 7 floors of a building and cannot get down, but some climb up and then at will visit the lower floors.
Okay, let's pause there. Again, this should remind us of the Vijnani. Once you understand this teaching of Vijnana, it gives a kind of framework for understanding many of his other teachings. You see? Here again, the idea is most people, when they attain the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, that Advaitic realization, he usually, in other places, he'll say, within 21 days of attaining that state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, you leave the physical body. For lack of food and because you're in that trance state, you don't come back. But he says certain people, whom he calls Ishvarakotis or Vijnanis, even after attaining that state, they can come back down. And that's what he means when he says, most people, once they go up to the roof, they can't come back. But there are some people who can go back and forth between the absolute and relative planes.
Uddhava said to the gopis, he whom you address as your Krishna dwells in all beings. It is he alone who has become the universe and is living and its living beings. Therefore I say, does a man meditate on God only when his eyes are closed? Doesn't he see anything of God when his eyes are open? Mahima, I have a question to ask, sir. A lover of God needs nirvana sometime or the other, doesn't he?
Okay, let's pause here. This is the question I was referring to in the morning. Mohima Chakravarti, you have to understand the context. So in fact, the first time Mohima Chakravarti comes into the Kautamrita is much earlier. M gives these nice little descriptions. Who are they? What's their background? What are their preferences? And so we learned that Mohima was a staunch follower of Shankara Advaita Vedanta. So that's important to keep in mind, even though he was a householder devotee. And so Mohima's it's important to keep in mind that he's asking this question from the standpoint of his own preferred philosophy. Because Shankara also says that even Bhakti Yoga is not a direct path to moksha, to liberation. It's a kind of intermediate step. It's a preparatory discipline. Ultimately, you have to attain the highest Advaitic realization somehow. So that's why he's saying, in Bangla, he says, Bhakto, er ekkala to nirvan chai. Even bhaktas, devotees of the personal God, those who worship the personal God, they also ultimately have to attain this Advaitic realization, don't they? This is the question. So now in that context, see how Sri Ramakrishna answers the question.
Master, it can be said that bhaktas need nirvana.
It cannot be said.
Sorry. It can't be said that bhaktas need nirvana. According to some schools, there is an eternal Krishna and there are also his eternal devotees. Krishna is spirit embodied and his abode is also spirit embodied.
Okay, again, so here, Bangla, Nirvan je chai emon kichu na. এরকম আছে যে নিত্য কৃষ্ণ তার নিত্য ভক্ত চিন্ময় শ্যাম চিন্ময় ধাম. This is again what I mentioned this morning. So he's directly saying no, bhaktas don't need Advaitic nirvana. And in some schools there is an eternal abode of Krishna and there are nitya bhaktas of Krishna. There are people who, they're not people, they're souls. Once they attain liberation, after they leave their physical bodies, they get what's called a body of Shuddha Sattva. This is explained in detail by the Bhakti Schools of Vedanta. If you study Swami Tapasanji's book, Bhakti Schools of Vedanta, he discusses all this. You have a body, it's a spiritual body made of Shuddha Sattva. It's not a material body and it's eternal. So you dwell in that higher loka with the personal God, you serve God, you worship God. And for them, that's the goal. They don't want the Advaitic Nirvana and they don't need it. This is his answer. Now he continues. Go ahead.
Master, it can't be said that bhaktas need nirvana. According to some schools, there is an eternal Krishna and there are also his eternal devotees. Krishna is spirit embodied and his abode is also spirit embodied. Krishna is eternal and the devotees are also eternal. Krishna and the devotees are like the moon and the stars, always near each other. You yourself repeat, what need is there of penance if God is seen within and without? Further, I have told you that the devotee who is born with an element of Vishnu cannot altogether get rid of bhakti. Once I fell into the clutches of a jnani who, this is jnani with a J, okay,
Yeah.
jnani cannot altogether get rid of bhakti. Once I fell into the clutches of a jnani who made me listen to the Vedanta for 11 months, but he couldn't altogether destroy the seed of bhakti. No matter where my mind wandered, it would come back to the Divine Mother. Whenever I sang of her, Nagata would weep and say, what is this? You see, he was such a great jnani, and still he wept. To the younger Norin and the others, Thakur says, remember the popular saying that if a man drinks the juice of the alik creeper, a plant grows inside his stomach. Once the seed of bhakti is sown, the effect is inevitable. You will gradually grow into a tree with flowers and fruits.
Okay, thanks. So he's saying a lot here. It's very interesting. First of all, notice that he's speaking directly to Mahima Chakravarti, and he knows he's an Advaitin, but at the same time, he's using his own words against him. He loved to sing this famous stotra with the refrain, Antar Bahir Yadi Harihi Tapasa Tatakyam. If you see God, Hari, God, both inside and outside, then what's the purpose of all austerities? We've already realized the highest. And he's saying, see, but that's what you're saying in that stotra is actually the Vijnana Bhava. And that's also a Bhakti Bhava. So he always will do this. You'll find in many places in the gospel, if the person is a follower of the Brahma Samaj who doesn't believe in the forms of God, he'll tell that Brahma Samaj follower, it's very good, your path is very good. It's good that you believe in the formless God, but never limit God to what you understand of him. And then he'll teach him about the Vaishnava approach. When an Advaitin will come, he'll remind him of Bhakti. When a Bhakta will come, he'll tell him about Advaita. So you'll notice this in different contexts. He's always trying to broaden the horizons of the Bhaktas and make sure that they don't become one-sided, fanatical, egoistic about their path. That's one thing. And the other thing which is interesting is he alludes to his Advaitic sadhana under Totapuri. He doesn't mention him by name. That's out of respect. He referred to Totapuri as the naked one, Nengta, which is interesting that is out of respect, but because he wouldn't wear clothes, Totapuri. But the way that he says it in Bangla, it's a very funny expression. Ami ek gyani pallai porechilam. 11 mas Vedanta shunale. As if he's like, it's very hard to explain the exact tone of the Bangla, but it's slightly tinged with a negative valence. I mean, so I fell into the clutches is a good translation, more or less. I fell into the clutches of a Gyani for 11 months, but he couldn't eradicate that seed of bhakti in me, you know? So interestingly, in response to Mohima's question, but bhaktas also need to have the Advaitic realization. He's giving his own example, saying, I had the Advaitic realization, still I came back to bhakti. Because for me, bhakti is the highest. This is what he's saying. It's very interesting. So using his own example, but giving a very sophisticated philosophical explanation as well. That remember, don't think that there's only one kind of salvation, that the highest salvation is Advaitic realization. Yeah.
That following your previous lecture, that this is really Thakur's contribution, that Kali and Brahman are one. I mean, in terms of philosophy and in terms of spiritual experience, and it is very revolutionary because it will, I mean, what because you call fanatics, you know, they will hate him for it.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that position?
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is that in some of the songs that he loved, like Ram Prasad's songs, it's there in most of the songs. Tumi Brahma, Tumi, you know, it's there. But somehow there were still especially Hindus, they were divided. There were Shaktas, there were Vaishnavas, there were Advaitins, and they were always fighting with each other. There's a new group of Brahma Samaj followers. They couldn't quite, you know, because as I said, he was a spiritual scientist. He practiced all those paths. And then he taught on the basis of his realizations. And that's very important. So I don't want to say that he was the first to teach that Kali is Brahman, that is the same reality, Abhed or something like that. But he's taught with such conviction and on the basis of his own realizations. I think that's really what. And at the same time, one thing that we should not underestimate is we sometimes think, well, he stopped his education at the age of 6. And so he, you know, we need to supplement his teachings with some proper philosophical framework. Let's bring in Shankara or this or that. I think that's a serious mistake. My approach, and I haven't found any problems with his approaches, treat this as a standalone text. You don't bring in any, in fact, when you bring in other frameworks, you confuse the issue. Because then, you know, if I'm trying to see this glass, I'm not going to put on orange spectacles or green spectacles. So don't do that. They become filters. Read it without any filters. And you'll find that there's a whole comprehensive and coherent philosophical framework that presented in his teachings without any need to bring in any kind of Advaitic metaphors or this from Vaishnavism and that from, he was a genius actually. Vivekananda once said this. He said Sri Ramakrishna had a tremendous intellect. We often think that Swamiji said that he was illiterate and this and that. No, he had a great mind also. And sometimes even monks, sometimes we don't give him the respect that he deserves. We think that he was an avatara and, you know, we should worship him, but we have to bring in some other, we should bring in this Gita or that, this. No, this itself is a standalone scripture. And the teachings are also standalone. That's my feeling. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, please continue.
Once the seed of bhakti is sown, the effect is inevitable. You will gradually grow into a tree with flowers and fruits. You may reason and argue 1,000 times, but if you have the seed of bhakti within you, you will surely come back to Hari. The devotees listened silently to the master.
Okay, one second. The other thing is, he also gives the example of Totapuri, how even though Totapuri was a staunch Advaitin, Sri Ramakrishna mentions that when Sri Ramakrishna would sing some devotional songs, Totapuri would burst into tears. Again, why does he say this? To Mohima in particular. You always have to remember the context. Thakur is trying to make Mohima broaden his mindset, not be such an Advaitic fanatic. How does he do it? He gives the example of his own Advaitic guru, saying, look, he was he was a realized soul, he was a Jivan Mukta, he was a Brahma Gyani, but he was also a Bhakta. He had that seed of, so even he had that seed of bhakti. That's why he cried when I sang devotional songs. He's trying to sort of change, expand and change the mind, reform the mind of Mohima. Yeah.
The devotees listened silently to the master. Sri Ramakrishna asked Mahima, laughing, "What is the thing you enjoy most?" Mahima, smiling, "Nothing, sir. I like mangoes." Master, smiling, "All by yourself, or do you want to share them with others?" Mahima, still smiling, "I'm not so anxious to give others a share. I may as well eat them all by myself." Master, "But do you know my attitude? I accept both the Nitya and the Leela. Doesn't God exist if one looks around with eyes open? After realizing him, one knows that he is both the absolute and the universe. It is he who is the indivisible Satchitananda. Again, it is he who has become the universe and its living being.
Yeah, thank you. So here we get another side of Sri Ramakrishna's divine personality, which is he was so charming, and he was very witty, and he could think on the spot immediately. So he would always outwit his interlocutors, the people he was talking to. So when he asked Mohima, what's your bhava? What do you like? Mohima makes a little joke, Am bhalo lage. He likes mangoes. And then immediately Sri Ramakrishna gives it a spiritual twist. Ki ekla ekla? Na apniyo khabe shobbaikiyo ektu ektu debe. He brings it to, so he's joking. It just seems like it's a very off-the-cuff kind of a little joke. He turns it into something, a very high spiritual teaching. Do you want only your own salvation, or do you want to help others at the same time? And just see, this is the seed of the slogan of our order, the Ramakrishna order, which Swamiji coined. Atmano mokshatam jagatitayacha. It's not just for our own salvation, but for the welfare of mankind. But see the ways that he imprints these ideas in the hearts of the people visiting him.
One needs sadhana. Mere study of the scriptures will not do. I noticed that through Vidyasagar, though Vidyasagar had no doubt read a great deal, he had not realized what was inside him. He was satisfied with helping boys get their education, but had not tasted the bliss of God. What will mere study accomplish? How little one assimilates. The almanac may forecast 20 measures of rain, but you don't get a drop by squeezing its pages.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is also nice. This is a controversial aspect of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, because he's saying again and again, just reading scriptures is not enough. And different followers in our tradition, different devotees, monks, they interpret this in different ways. Some people say, see, therefore, he didn't encourage the study of scripture. We don't need to read the scriptures at all. Sometimes in training center, Brahmacharis go to a training center for 2 years, and some of the ones who aren't interested in studies, they'll quote this. Thakur didn't say that we should study these scriptures. That's not important for God realization. And it's very difficult to argue against it because they're quoting from the Kathamrita, you know. So how do we understand these teachings? That's also very important. There are a few things like this where they've created controversy in our order and outside the order about what exactly Thakur meant. Another very controversial teaching of his is about this Shambhu Modlik. He said, Shambhu Modlik he was interested in creating hospitals for the poor and this and that. And then Sri Ramakrishna said, if God came to you and gave his vision to you, would you tell him, God, oh God, I want hospitals, and almost poking him, right? So some people think, oh, therefore, and some scholars claim that this shows that Sri Ramakrishna and Swamiji were at odds on this issue of seva. And that Sri Ramakrishna didn't encourage seva so much, but that Swamiji made it one of the core practices in spiritual life and even for sannyasis. In fact, some of the direct monastic disciples of Sri Ramakrishna argued with Swamiji on this point. Are any of you familiar with this dispute? Yoganandaji. After Swamiji came back from the West, Yoganandaji just pounced on him and said, you didn't preach Sri Ramakrishna in the West. You taught only your own ideas and some Christian things, and now you're bringing back those Christian ideas and you're emphasizing service. Thakur never encouraged service. Why are you bringing that in? So these are very controversial issues. And so some scholars even now, they claim that there's a deviation between Thakur and Swamiji on these issues. So I don't want to give you easy answers. I want to raise these as questions so that you should all think for yourselves about that. But in this context, with regard to what is the value of scriptures, one thing that's very important to keep in mind is don't take passages out of context. Try to be comprehensive. And try to reconcile all the different statements he says about the scriptures. Another thing that he says, which is almost the opposite of this, is he would have these little mantras, and one of the things that he asked people to repeat is Bhagavata Bhakta Bhagavan. Bhagavat Bhakta Bhagavan in Bangla. Right? And what did he mean by that? What do you think he meant by that? What is Bhagavata?
Scripture.
What scripture is this? What's the long name? Srimad Bhagavata Purana. It's a great scripture about the life of Krishna, Sri Krishna, the avatar of Krishna. Bhakta is the devotee. Bhagavan is God. So what does this mantra mean? Bhagavata Bhakta Bhagavan. Why did he want people to repeat this mantra?
They're all equal.
They're all one. The scripture is no less than God. So far from saying don't read scriptures, he's saying the scripture itself is Bhagavan, is God. It's divine. So if you take just this teaching and say that he dismissed the scriptures, or if you just take the Bhagavata Bhakta Bhagavan and say that he said that the scriptures are God, it'll become one-sided, the interpretation. You have to always try to be comprehensive when you interpret Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And always, so what I do is I have a soft copy, a PDF of the gospel, both in Bangla and in English. And I do keyword searches, and if I'm interested in his views on a particular topic, if it's scripture or Advaita or whatever it is, I type in the word and then I find every single reference. And then I compile a database. And then I look at, in the original Bangla, what he says. And then I try to make sense of what he's saying as a whole. It's very dangerous to take one teaching out of context and then say this represents Sri Ramakrishna's view. That's what I wanted to say. So think about it for yourselves. What exactly is the role of scripture? He says other things about scripture as well, in other contexts. Please keep reading.
And this point comes in a reaction to the jnana and bhakti thing, right?
Yeah, that's also important, the context. Yeah, well, say more if you want.
Okay.
Yeah, so well, yeah, we can think about that also. I mean, this is the context with, he's speaking of Mahima Chakraborty, it's in the context of jnana and bhakti are not mutually exclusive, but that both go kind of hand in hand. Yeah. I guess also, yeah, one thing that's important from what you said is that Mahima was a very intellectual type of person, and he loved studying scriptures. And partly that was probably Sri Ramakrishna poking him and saying that, for him in particular, it's also necessary that you shouldn't just stop with just reading scriptures. You have to, engage in spiritual practice, overcome worldly attachments, and cultivate dispassion.
So, Mahima, we have so many duties in the world. Where is the time for sadhana? Master, why should you say such a thing? It is you who describe the world as illusory, like a dream. Rama and Lakshmana wanted to go to Ceylon, but the ocean was before them. Lakshmana was angry. Taking his bow and arrow, he said, I shall kill Varuna. This ocean prevents our going to Ceylon. Rama explained the matter to him, saying, Lakshmana, all that you're seeing is unreal, like a dream. The ocean is unreal. Your anger is also unreal. It is equally unreal to think of destroying one unreal thing by means of another. Mahimachan kept quiet.
Okay, this again is very interesting. Again, you have to keep in mind, he's specifically teaching Mahimachan. And this comes back to something we talked about in the morning. Who is eligible to practice Advaita Vedanta?
It's hard.
It's very difficult. And it's easy to talk about Advaita Vedanta, and very difficult to practice it. And that's what Sri Ramakrishna is putting into his head. Because Mahima is saying, how can I do sadhana? I'm in the middle of samsara. Sri Ramakrishna says, you're talking all day about how Jagat is supposed to be mithya. And now suddenly samsara is such a big deal for you that you can't do sadhana. You're being a hypocrite. I mean, he's saying it in a gentle way, so he doesn't. So that's another thing about he'll give some fairly harsh teachings. Sometimes he'll be very harsh. Other times he'll do it in such a way that it'll go deep in the heart, but without hurting the person. Sometimes he'll be like he'll directly cut. There's one time in the Kathamrita when Sri Ramakrishna suddenly starts severely scolding Mohanad Gupta, the author of the Kathamrita, in front of everybody. Ekhono poshu bhav. You're still behaving like an ordinary animal. You're still having sex with your wife. I mean, like this, directly in front of everyone. Shame on you. So there are different ways that he taught in different contexts for different people, and so we have to keep that in mind also. Yeah.
Mahimachan kept quiet. He had many duties in the world. He had lately started a school to help others. Master to Mahima. Shambhu once said to me, I have some money. It is my desire to spend it for good works.
So this is the one.
For schools and dispensaries, roads and so forth. I said to him, it will be good if you can do these works in a selfless spirit, but it is extremely difficult to perform unselfish action. Desire for fruit comes from nobody knows where. Let me ask you something. Suppose God appears before you. Will you pray to him? Then for such things as schools and dispensaries and hospitals? A devotee. So what is the way for worldly people?
Okay, let's pause here, because this is what I just mentioned about Shambhu Mullik. And again, so he mentions this Shambhu Mullik thing in different contexts. It comes up at least 3 or 4 times in the 1,000 pages I've seen. This is one. But this is one of the best places, because he explains exactly what he's scolding Shambhu Malik for and what he's saying, what his stance is. It's not that we should not build dispensaries and hospitals and schools. If that were the case, then the whole Ramakrishna mission would be deviating from Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, because most of our centers in India we have orphanages, we have schools, we have hospitals. They're supposed to be charitable institutions. But what does Sri Ramakrishna say here? আমি বললাম নিষ্কাম ভাবে করতে পারো সে ভালো কিন্তু নিষ্কাম কর্ম করা বড় কঠিন কোন দিক দিয়ে কামনা এসে পড়ে so he's saying you should do these things Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar is doing those kinds of things but it's extremely difficult to do charitable works in a selfless spirit কোথায় থেকে you don't know where ego will creep in I'm donating some amount of money for a charity and then suddenly I'll have this impulse, I want my name to be displayed on a plaque in front of the school. You see, these kinds of things, you don't know where. So he's saying, this is good that you're doing it, but it's difficult and be aware of the dangers. So he's not anti-seva, but you should be careful about the attitude with which you do the seva. That seems to be what he's emphasizing.
A devotee. Sir, what is the way for worldly people? Master, the company of holy men. Worldly people should listen to spiritual talk. They are in a state of madness, intoxicated with woman and gold. A drunkard should be given rice water as an antidote. Drinking it slowly, he gradually recovers his normal consciousness. A worldly person should also receive instruction from a Sadguru, a real teacher. Such a teacher has certain signs. You should hear about Banaras only from a man who has been to Banaras and seen it. Mere book learning will not do. One should not receive instruction from a Pandit who has not realized the world to be unreal. Only if a Pandit has discrimination and renunciation is he entitled to instruct.
Okay, here's an interesting case where Medhanandaji's translation has, I think, there are some discrepancies. So let me read the Bangla a little bit carefully here. A Shatgurur kache upadesh lote hai. You should take instructions from a Sadguru. That's okay. Not this Sadguru, the one that's famous. Okay. Shatgurur লক্ষণ আছে যে কাশী গিয়েছে আর দেখেছে তার কাছেই কাশী কথা শুনতে হয় শুধু পণ্ডিত হলে হয় না যার সংসার অনিত্য বলে বোধ হয় না সেই পণ্ডিতের কাছে উপদেশ লওয়া উচিত নয় Now here the Bangla is that person who has not realized that this samsara is anitya. The word is anitya, impermanent. And Niklanji translates it as unreal. You see, there's a little bias toward Advaita Vedanta here. These things they seem like very minor points, but they're very important because it distorts the meaning of what Sri Ramakrishna is saying. So there are some places where I respectfully disagree with Niklanji. That's very important because another way to answer your question in the morning, you disappeared because you had to go somewhere, but part of the thing, you asked about Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. But one aspect of this is, what does Sri Ramakrishna mean by Mithya? If you do a study just on the word mithya, if you do a keyboard search on mithya, you're going to find there's a place where he explicitly defines mithya as anitya, which is not the way that Shankara understands it. He says because something is anitya, it's unreal. It doesn't exist. Anitya means, look, I have a block of wood. I'm a carpenter. I make it into a wooden table. That table you can see is anitya. And then ultimately, I break it down into pieces, it becomes wood again. It's not a table anymore. Does it make sense to say that because the table was anitya, it never existed? Or does it make sense to say that it existed for the time it existed, and then it went back to its form as wood? Right? You see what I mean? So anitya, impermanence, is not the same as unreality. So that's a very subtle point, but it's a very important one.
Maharaj, is there therefore anything unreal from that perspective? Because unreal actually means that it doesn't exist at all. Whereas impermanent means it's there for a short period of time, and then it changes.
It could be a long period of time. See, anitya does not even mean short, but it means it doesn't last forever.
It doesn't last forever.
Exactly. And another thing is, I was talking to some of you outside about this earlier, but Swamiji, he said that we need to reinterpret the Vedantic scriptures in the light of Sri Ramakrishna. And one place where this is very helpful is in Chandogya Upanishad. There's a passage where the relationship between Brahman and this world is being described. And the text uses a number of metaphors. Many of you are probably familiar with some of them. One is gold and gold ornaments. Another one is clay and clay pots, mritika, right? And now notice that both of these metaphors, they don't support that. Does it make sense to say that when I shape a piece of gold into a golden earring or a golden necklace, does it make sense to say that that necklace is mithya, that it doesn't exist? No. It's an actual formation, an actual manifestation of the gold. If you melt the necklace, it'll become gold again. That doesn't mean that the necklace never existed. So the Upanishad's own examples don't seem to support this staunch, this like pure orthodox Shankara kind of Advaita Vedanta. You see what I mean? And this is what Swamiji wanted us to do. He wanted us to reinterpret that. Don't be biased by any particular interpretation. Try to understand what the scriptures themselves are saying. Take the scriptural statements at face value and then try to give them an interpretation. And one help in doing that is bringing in the life and teachings of Sri Ramakrishna. Why? Because Sri Ramakrishna was the Samavaya Avatar, as I talked about this morning. And the scriptures are always trying to harmonize. Especially the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is a scripture of harmonizing. I mean, every chapter is about a different kind of yoga. It's harmonizing different conceptions of God. God is Avatara. God is the personal but formless God. God is Atman. You see. So, what time is it? 2:54. I think we can... Should we stop here? Should we... Huh? Okay, well, how much more do we have?
Another page.
Okay, go ahead and finish it, and then we'll, yeah. I probably won't interject anymore. Shamadhyaya, I think.
Yeah. Shamadhyaya remarked that God was dry. Think of his speaking like that of him who is the embodiment of sweetness. It sounds like the remark, "My uncle's cow shed is full of horses." All laugh. Yes, a worldly person is in a state of intoxication. He always says to himself, "It is I who am doing everything. All these, the house and family, are mine." Baring his teeth, he says, "What will happen to my wife and my children without me? How will they get along? Who will look after my wife and children?" Rakal said one day, "What will happen to my wife?" Haramohan. Did Rakal say that? Master, what else could he do? He who has knowledge has ignorance also. How amazing. Lakshmana said to Rama, even a sage like Vashishta is stricken with grief because of the death of his sons. Brother, replied Rama, he who has knowledge has ignorance also. Therefore, go beyond both knowledge and ignorance. Suppose a thorn has pierced a man's foot. He picks another thorn to pull out the first one. After extracting the first thorn with the help of the second, he throws both away. One should use the thorn of knowledge to pull out the thorn of ignorance. Then one throws away both of them. Knowledge and ignorance and attains Vijnana. What is Vijnana? It is to know God distinctly by realizing His existence through an intuitive experience and to go speak to Him intimately. That is why Sri Krishna said to Arjuna, go beyond the three gunas. In order to attain Vijnana, one has to accept the help of Vidyamaya. Vidyamaya introduces discrimination, includes discrimination. That is to say, God is real and the world illusory. And dispassion and also chanting the God's name and glories, meditation, the company of holy persons, prayer and so forth.
Okay, I have to pause again. This is somebody's phone, I believe. Somebody's phone? Oh, what?
Oh, I thought it was outside.
Okay. So, here again, Sri Ramakrishna, sometimes he introduces these very novel philosophical concepts, and one of them is a distinction between two kinds of maya, avidya maya and vidya maya, the maya of ignorance and the maya of knowledge. You don't find that in the traditional spiritual literature as far as I'm aware. And he's defining vidya maya, the maya of knowledge. These are basically things that help you to realize God. And he gives examples. He says, এই বিজ্ঞান লাভ করবার জন্য বিদ্যা মায়া আশ্রয় করতে হবে। ওখানে সরি ঈশ্বর সত্য ঈশ্বর সত্য জগৎ অনিত্য এই বিচার অর্থাৎ বিবেক বৈরাগ্য. Again, Medhanandaji, notice how he translates ঈশ্বর সত্য, God is real. Should we shut this or we can't shut it? Okay, that's better. So he's giving an example of what is Vidya Maya, the yoga, the Maya of knowledge, and he's saying this kind of vichara, you should do this kind of reasoning. Ishwar Shotto Jagat Anitto, a vichar. And how does Medhanandaji translate it? Vidya Maya. Illusory. Look up the word illusory. You just read it. So
After
Just before
the
that.
first one, thought of ignorance, and one was we both
later. Okay.
What is Vijnana? Existence through an intuitive experience, and to go speak to him individually.
Vidya Maya, the Maya of knowledge. Where is it? You just read it. Okay.
Sorry.
Where are you? Here?
I'm here.
Yeah.
The first is later on, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so here he says, in order to attain Vijnana, one has to accept the help of Vidya Maya. Vidya Maya includes discrimination. That is to say, God is real and the world illusory. Again, he's translating anitya, impermanent, as illusory. So first time it was unreal, now it's illusory. Again, you can see the Advaitic bias coming in. And I mentioned to some of you earlier that in the original Bangla, there's a passage when Mohanlal Gupta, sometimes he expresses his own thoughts, but he's very careful not to put his thoughts into the words into the mouth of Sri Ramakrishna. He says, these are my thoughts, this is the reflections of a bhakta, something like that. So in one place he says, Thakur was not an Advaita Vedantin. He was a follower of Ramanuja because he did not dismiss this world as unreal. He believed, he used the example of a bale fruit. This is Mohanlal Gupta saying, that because in that bale fruit example, saying that you cannot just take the pulp of the bale fruit. To get the full weight, you should also take the seeds and the shell and the whole thing. Nikhilamanji in the English translation deletes the whole paragraph. So again, we have to be a little careful about when we read translations of texts in general, but especially with the Kathamrita. It's a very, very good translation, masterful translation, but sometimes there are these very subtle places where he's tilting your interpretation. He's kind of bringing in this Advaitic filter to reading Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, which I think is misleading. Yeah.
Okay. I'll read this one again. I think in order to attain Vijnana, one has to accept the help of Vidya Maya. Vidya Maya includes discrimination, that is to say, God is real and the world illusory, and dispassion, and also chanting God's name and glories, meditation, the company of holy persons, prayer, and so forth. Vidya Maya may be likened to the last few steps before the roof. Next is the roof, the realization of God. Worldly people are in a state of chronic intoxication, mad with woman and gold. They are insensible to spiritual ideas. That is why I love the youngsters, not yet stained by woman and gold. They are good receptacles and may become useful in God's work. But as for worldly people, you lose almost everything while trying to eliminate the worthless stuff in them. They are like bony fish, almost all bones and very little meat. Worldly people are like mangoes, struck by hail. If you want to offer them to God, you have to purify them by sprinkling them with Ganga water. Even then, they are seldom used in the temple worship. If you are to use them at all, you have to apply Brahmagyana. That is to say, you have to persuade yourself that it is God alone who has become everything. A theosophist gentleman arrived with Ashwini Kumar Datta and the son of Bihari Bhaduri. The Mukherjee brothers entered the room and saluted Sri Ramakrishna. Arrangements were being made for devotional music in the courtyard. At first beat of the drum, the master left the room and went there. The devotees followed him. Bhavanath introduced Ashwini to the master. The master introduced him to M. Ashwini and M were talking together while Narendra arrived. Sri Ramakrishna said to Ashwini, "This is Narendra."
Om Niranjanam Nityamanantarupam Bhaktanukampatripadigraham vai
ईशावतारं परमेशमीड्यं तं रामकृष्णं शिरसा नमामि